Good morning. My name is Lisa Poff, and I am the project coordinator with the Indiana Deafblind Services Project. I want to welcome you to this morning's virtual workshop, Being a Perceptive Reflective Detective, a multisensory approach to assessment and learning, with our speaker, David Brown. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to David, who can introduce himself and get us going.
Thank you, Lisa. Good morning, everyone. I'm in San Francisco, California, where it's only 7 o'clock in the morning. And it's dark, not just because it's 7 o'clock, but as you probably know, we have a huge problem with toxic smoke because of wildfires. So all the lights are on in the house, and they will be on all day so that we can see what we're doing. The health advisory says we should not go outside. And if we do go outside, it shouldn't be for more than 5 minutes. But I have 2 dogs. So we have to go outside, and I'm outside probably in a typical day. I'm outside for about 3 hours. So I'm using eye drops because my eyes are burning. And as you can hear, my throat is very dry. So I have lots of water and coffee here, and I hope I'm not too difficult to listen to. I was meant to be in Indiana today and tomorrow and Sunday. Lisa got me to agree to this well over a year ago when we met in Texas. And then, of course, we had to think about, because of the pandemic, changing it to make it virtual like this. And I had planned things for being there in person, doing a whole day. And now I have to contain these things into 2 hours. And I looked through my slideshow, and, you know, my slides are my babies. And I was thinking, what can I cut? There's far too much here. What can I cut? And I cut almost nothing because it all looked useful and it all looked important. So I'm going to be jumping through the slideshow quite a bit. I hope that doesn't make things incoherent. But the important thing that you need is my email address, which is here, welshgold@gmail.com. Because once I've finished today, you may well want to contact me for more information, or you might want to ask questions, you might want to share stories. You might also like the slideshow, and I don't think you have the slideshow at the moment. The slideshow has a lot of photographs, and I don't have parental permission to give the photographs, only to show them. So if you'd like the slideshow, which you probably would, I will have to remove all the photographs, and then I can send you the slideshow very, very easily. So do make a note of welshgold@gmail.com. I've been a teacher for 47 years. I can't believe I'm approaching half a century as a teacher, but I've only been in the deafblind field for 37 years. And during that time, I very much developed an ability to observe children and base my assessment very much on observation. And one of the things I always complain about in the special education field is how little attention people pay to individual children. And I know we're all busy. I know we have all sorts of obligations that take up a lot of time and that we have to follow because they're mandatory. But I think there's a danger of thinking in terms of types of child and very quick looking at a child maybe for a few minutes, reading some notes and thinking, this girl is type B or type C, and then going with that. and not really spending time getting to know the child. And to me, assessment is about getting to know you. I really like to put it in ordinary language. Assessment has a strange aura about it. It's seen as something very specialized, which it can indeed be. It's seen as something very formal, which it can be, but it can also be very ordinary and very familiar to all of us. I've worked with parents for all of my teaching career. I was only a school teacher for 1 year, that was teaching history in high school. I was a complete failure, and I moved into special education. Working with parents, I'm always struck by how much parents know about their child and how little they themselves value that knowledge, how they lack confidence to push that knowledge as important for the child, and how much professional services maybe downplay the importance of those things. And I have a quote here from a book by Oliver Sacks, who many of you will be familiar with. The book is called Musicophilia, and it's a book about music and the impact of music on our brains, on our cognitive ability, and especially, of course, on our emotions and on our self-regulation. And he talks about, in his lifetime, this was just before he died, the amazing development of technology and scanning, the ability to look at a brain and see a brain activating in response to things that are happening to the person. And he ends by saying, these new insights of neuroscience are exciting beyond measure, but there is always a certain danger that the simple art of observation may be lost, that clinical description may become perfunctory, and the richness of the human context ignored. And that quote really jumped out of the book at me, because that's very much what I'm saying to you this morning. Close, meticulous observation of the child, and then interpreting what you observe, sharing your observations with others, and coming together to make the best interpretation possible of what you've observed, is really where everything starts, and it should be where all your assessment finishes as well. Whatever kind of specialist assessment you've had, whatever kind of technical, medical type assessment you've had, it has to come down to what he calls the simple art of observation, clinical description, and always recognizing the richness of the human context. Each of these children is a complete human being. They're not a type, but I understand why we think in terms of types, because it makes our job a little quicker and a little easier. And if we really observe carefully, when we see a child like this, I'm going to show you a series of pictures of a boy I met in the Netherlands 2 years ago. He's about 6 or 7 years old. He always wears his backpack like this on top of his head, with the straps pulling up hard under his armpits. Oh, this is I've slipped in a few other children, I forgot. This is a boy who, for a period, liked his t-shirts on top of his head, not around his neck. Here's the first boy again in a swing, but as you can see, he's upside down with his head and his hands on the floor, and his lap is on the swing upside down, as it were. And there's a reason children are doing these things. Here's a girl who's jamming both feet into one sock. And here, last picture for now, here's a child using a tablet very efficiently, upside down with the head and the hands on the floor, the knees up on the couch, and the tablet down on the floor. All these behaviors may look a little strange. They may look crazy, and people would often use the word crazy, and that's fine, as long as we remember they're all functional adaptive behaviors, and they're all giving us valuable assessment information about the child, what they need, how they're thinking, how they go about getting what they need. And if we watch, for example, this boy on the screen now, if we watch this boy before he gets on the swing and then after he gets off, we may be able to get an even better idea of what he achieved by spending time on the swing, or what this girl achieved by jamming both her feet in one sock, and what this child did by being upside down. So it's the whole message of the whole day, both webinars today. The bottom line message is observe carefully and work hard to interpret what you observe, because the child is your best resource if you're trying to assess them. And I know that might sound very obvious, but you really have to do that, and you have to believe it. My background, I was influenced very much by three of the great figures in our field. All three of them are now dead, unfortunately. Lily Nielsen was a Danish teacher of the blind. She developed a system called active learning. She felt that children who were blind with additional disabilities, we were doing too much to them, and we were doing too much for them, and that we should be thinking more about facilitating them doing things for themselves. And a big part of that means adapting the environment around the child. My take on her is all these things. She was very hands-off. She put a lot of emphasis on developing the child's self-image and self-esteem. She talked about giving the child time, their time, not our time, close observation. And the last but one point is the really big thing I got from her: the concept of changing the environment to help the child to change. If you wanted to change the child, maybe you didn't have to do anything to them. Maybe you could do something about the environment they were in and see what kind of change happens. And once I heard her saying that way back in 1983, I think, I started to realize how much I was changing the environment in order to help children change and to help them function more effectively. And that's had a big impact on me. The next guru is my big guru, Jan van Dijk. He only died at the beginning of last year. He was a Dutch psychologist and teacher of the deaf. And from him, I got a surprisingly similar list. Follow the child, observe carefully, identify and use the child's motivators, work at the child's pacing, credit all the child's behaviors with meaning, even if they look crazy, respect and seek the opinions of others. Don't assume that you by yourself can do all of this. It has to be a team effort. Because he was from the deaf world, he said every interaction with the child should be structured like a conversation, where you do something and then you pause for the child to do something back. And then my third guru was an occupational therapist, Jean Ayres, who died a long time ago. She developed sensory integration theory and therapy. And from Jean Ayres, I take the theory of sensory integration, although I'm a teacher, not an occupational therapist. I like the ideas of sensory modulation, enhancing and inhibiting. I don't have time to say a lot about that this morning, but the idea that our brains are being bombarded through all our senses all of the time, and we have to learn to modulate our senses so that we can focus on some sensory inputs and we can ignore the others. And focusing on things is enhancing, and ignoring the others is inhibiting. And that can be a very difficult problem for children with deafblindness. It can be very hard for them to know, from this mass of information coming into their brains, what should they be paying attention to and what should they be ignoring. And we might need, as part of our educational plan, to be addressing those challenges and working together with the therapists to try and help the child achieve a better sense of sensory modulation. She talks about observing children closely to see what kind of sensory inputs do they look for, what do they like, and which ones do they avoid and dislike. And her successors have come up with the idea of sensory diet. Jean Ayres talks about it, but she didn't use those words. And I'll say a lot about sensory diet in a while. She also talked about the direct connection between sensory inputs and levels of arousal. And if you want to follow these things further, I would recommend reading up on Lily Nielsen, Jan van Dijk, and Jean Ayres, because they all have a lot to teach us. And together, I think I would say, if you put those three people together, what did I get from them? First of all, the need to be very child-focused, but also the need to be child-led. Van Dijk talks about follow the child. And he's very aware that that almost turns traditional teaching on its head. You know, when I was a schoolboy, teachers led and I followed. And if I didn't follow, I got punished and I got lower grades and I failed examinations. And the idea that the child leads and we follow is very challenging for a lot of teachers and for a lot of therapists and a lot of parents and family members. And it means something specific. I sent Lisa a resources list of articles. Every article, I think, has a link so that you can find it online. And there's an article there there are two articles by me, a very old one called Follow the Child, and then a more recent one called What Does Follow the Child Mean? And I would recommend them, especially the second one, if you want more information about what does follow the child mean in real terms and how can you do it effectively. What it doesn't mean is just letting the child do anything they like all day, every day. I have to say that because I've been accused of saying that in my presentations, and that's not what I'm saying. They talk about meticulous observation, meticulous interpretation, challenging the child, but knowing them well enough to build success into the challenges. That's good teaching. Thinking about the child's self-image and self-confidence, which we should be boosting all the time. Recognizing that sensory functioning depends on lots and lots of things, both inside the child and in the environment outside. And all three of these people were great mavericks. They all made themselves very unpopular with ideas that were seen at the time as being pretty crazy. And a little focus on sensory diet, but this will come back. What it means is just like you have a nutritional diet, which is what you eat and drink, and we know that our dietary needs change. There are times when we need sugar. There are times when we need salt. There are times when we need food and times when we don't. Times when we need a drink and times when we don't. Times when it's specifically chocolate we need. If you were me, times when you need a single malt whiskey, which has happened a lot over the last 6 months. And similarly, we have a sensory diet, and it's the kind of sensory inputs that we need from moment to moment. And that changes, and it changes depending on internal factors in us, but also on external factors. Times when the environment is too noisy and we need to move to a quieter spot. Times when we've been sitting too long and we're finding it hard to concentrate. And what do? We stretch, we stand up, we might jump a bit, we might go for a walk, and then we come back. And in theory, if we've done the right thing, our attention level should have increased because of the sensory inputs we've just given us. And I'm a big believer that if we observe children carefully, and if we think about what we're observing in terms of the sensory diet the child is giving themselves, when a child flaps their hands, what kind of sensory input are they giving themselves by flapping the hand? So what's the behavior? What kind of sensory input are they giving themselves through the behavior? And then interpreting why would they want that sensory input? And I believe hand flapping, generally speaking, gives strong proprioceptive input. Strong proprioceptive input tends to be very calming. And when you observe children who hand flap, they often do it at times of very heightened arousal. When they're very frightened, when they're very anxious, when they're very angry, when they're very excited, when they're very bored and stressed. And after they hand flap, you may well find that those negative arousal level behaviors have dropped, that the shoulders come down, that they're able to focus a little better, that their breathing slows down to a more normal pace, and those kinds of things. It's all quite complicated, and there's always a danger when somebody like me is presenting a lot of complex stuff in 2 hours. You have to go quickly. You have to make it sound fairly clear and simple, even though it actually isn't. So please don't think what I'm talking about is easy for me. It's very challenging. And in my article called "What Does Follow the Child Mean?", I say at one point, going into someone's classroom or someone's home and observing a child for 2 or 3 hours is exhausting if you do it properly. And if you're taking notes, and if you're then following up with discussion and sharing and interpretation. So we're talking some complex issues. And then a little bit about deafblindness. When you look at the deafblind education world, it's very interesting. We have a few basic imperatives, really. They're like orders, which is why I've written them with exclamation points after them. Follow the child, know the child, individualize, do with, not for, create conversations in everything you do, and use a multisensory perspective for assessment and for teaching. And it's that multisensory perspective that I'll be talking about today. The population of children with deafblindness, I've been in the field 37 years, and of course, I've seen the population change very, very dramatically. And probably the biggest change is in the medical complexity of the children. More and more complex medical issues, more and more complex disability, and our teaching time being eaten into by the need for all kinds of medical and paramedical nursing type procedures. And for more and more of the children we work with these days, this is how they began their lives. this is how they first met the world. And this is how the world first met them. And sometimes this was their world for a couple of weeks, sometimes a couple of months, and sometimes for several years. And that has big implications for the way they develop, for the interests they show and the aversions they show. But it also has big implications if, like me, you work with families, because these kind of early, very, very difficult medical and nursing situations have a lasting impact on the family's view of the child and their approach to the child. And the population it's pretty unique and very complicated. So we have to remember that when we're simplifying into types of child, when we're looking at cognitive level and putting all the children at one type of cognitive level together in a group, that doesn't necessarily mean that they will fit together in a group. There's a very high level of individuality. And as we all know, grouping these children is difficult. They often need to be taught more or less one-to-one. They need a lot of direct teaching because of their difficulties with incidental learning. They do learn incidentally, especially from their own bodies, and we need to respect that, but sometimes they get very stuck on that through self-stimulation behaviors. And I've made this slide to try and get through complexity very quickly. The size of the population. The population has grown enormously as the label deafblind has been stretched to apply to more and more children. When I came into the field 37 years ago, we didn't, in England, we didn't see these very medically complex children. I was working in deafblindness for about 5 years before I saw a child with a gastrostomy tube. I didn't even know what it was when I saw it. Now, it feels like they're almost universal in the younger population. They're much more common. It was even more years before I met a child with a trach for breathing issues. And again, it's not so unusual now to see children in our deafblind population with trachs. We've seen on the auditory side, we've seen hearing aid technology dramatically develop. We've seen amplification and cochlear implants provided for multiply disabled children who weren't considered available for that kind of technology in the past, but now are considered part of the population. So it's a big population. There are multiple etiologies. I've been involved with children with charge syndrome for a long time. So I'm considered a specialist in charge syndrome, but charge is only one of the many, many etiologies we have in the population. There's a huge range of vision and hearing loss. And of course, functional vision and functional hearing varies from moment to moment for all sorts of reasons. There are lots and lots of neurological issues that nobody really understands, variable functioning, multiple additional anomalies. So there are very few children with an eye defect and a sensory neural hearing loss, and everything else is okay. Medical priorities, which push teaching a little to the side. Many specialists are needed, and there's a big scarcity of professionals who know how to assess and how to teach. I've got some figures from the census. I won't go into those, but I will show this slide. I mentioned charge syndrome. Children with charge syndrome are often called lazy. And actually, children with deafblindness are often called lazy. And it always gets me pretty angry. And of course, everybody can be lazy, and we all are lazy at times. And our ability to be lazy depends on lots of things, not least our motivation, our interest, but also on all sorts of other things. I looked at charge syndrome and I came up with 21 anomalies that are very common in charge syndrome, each one of which can cause fatigue. So think of visual impairment. If you have significant visual impairment, it's very challenging to function in the world. Everything takes longer. You have to concentrate on things much more than sighted people do. And you need regular breaks because this is very tiring. Take each of these issues down these bullet points and think about why that person might get tired more easily than you or I do. Then put lots of these together in one child and you start to think, what I'm seeing as laziness may well not be laziness. That might be a misinterpretation of what we're seeing. But of course, if you really know the child, then you're in a better position to know when they are genuinely being lazy or they're pushing you to try and get out of doing things, or to send a message, a different message to you. This is a quote from Natalie Barriger. And again, this is an important point. Visual functioning is related in part to the condition of the eye. And yes, if the child has a cataract, if the child's eyes are missing, if they are unusually small, that's going to have implications for their visual functioning. But she makes the point that a lot of other things are in play when we look at a child's visual functioning. And she says more explicitly, visual functioning is determined by the experiences, motivations, needs, and expectations of each individual in relation to whatever visual capacity is available to satisfy curiosity and accomplish activities for personal satisfaction. And what she's saying, and I've underlined some of those words, she's talking about the emotional heart of the child. What are their previous experiences? What are their motivators? What do they like? What do they want? What do they expect? What do they dislike? How curious are they? And all those things are going to have a massive impact on how well they use the vision they've got. So a child with very low vision, if they're very highly motivated, if they have a positive self-image, if they're very curious about the world, they will use the vision they've got very well. A child with more visual potential, who's very depressed, who has low expectations, who perhaps isn't feeling great, or is perhaps rather socially anxious and shy, they're probably not going to use their vision as well. And purely by observation, you might assume that the first child has more vision than the second child, where in fact it's the other way around. But the first child is using their vision more effectively. And that's part of the complication. So when you are thinking about assessing a child's functional vision, you mustn't just think about the eyes, you have to think of the whole child, because we don't see with our eyes, we see with our brains. And brains are prone to emotions, and the emotions are very powerful. And this is something that you pick up very strongly from the three gurus I spoke about at the beginning of this talk. And in fact, the brain can often see things that the eyes don't see. I've got what I call trick photos. Here you see a van, the sliding door is open, and it changes the lettering on the side of the van. And because you recognize the logo, you know what that should say, but it ends up spelling a different word. Here is a picture of a woman. It looks like a woman whose the top part of her face is human and the bottom part is a dog. And we know, because we have visual experience and we know about things like perspective, we know what's happened in these pictures, but they're funny because our eyes tell us one thing, but our brains are seeing more than our eyes can see. Here is a cat who looks as if he's from Mars. He has two dandelions behind him, which look like antennae. A cat sitting on a cushion. I always think I put too many of these pictures in, but this might be your favorite part of this whole webinar. It is my favorite part. Here's a cat in a shopping bag, and it's got the torso of a bodybuilder, but the cat's head. And here is a man sitting on a bus looking like an alien because one of the bars for holding on to is covering his face. And when people are assessing children, they often focus excessively on the disabilities rather than their abilities. And focusing on their abilities often reveals more about the difficulties they face and the strategies they use to function effectively. We have to be careful to avoid deficit assessment. And deficit assessment is surprisingly common. How often have you been in a situation where a child is assessed? Usually someone has an assessment tool or a standardized way of assessing that they usually learned in their professional training. And at the end of the assessment, you've got an enormous list of things the child can't do and only a very small list of things the child can. And that would be an example of deficit assessment. And it's not terribly useful. It might be helpful if your job is to decide eligibility. Should this child get this service, or are they not eligible? But if you're a teacher and if you're thinking about education and development, the last thing you need is deficit assessment, because knowing what a child can't do doesn't actually tell you how to teach and where to start. Knowing what a child can do tells you where to look and where to start. And I'll push that a lot today. And remember that everything children with deafblindness do has meaning for them. And the first obligation on the teacher is to work out that meaning, or at least to come up with a good guess, often in discussion with other people. So credit the children's behavior with meaning. And that especially includes self-stimulation. I'll talk a lot about self-stimulation later on. And as I've already implied, deafblindness now involves many more senses than just vision and hearing. And it's not enough to just consider the touch sense as an extra compensatory channel for functioning and learning. From the blind field, we've had a lot of great ideas about using touch to compensate for the child having vision and hearing problems. And we know, for example, that sign language and finger spelling can sometimes be conveyed through touch rather than visually. And we know that objects and tactile symbols can be used. But we need to think about all the senses, not just vision, hearing, and touch. And that's why I'm showing my next slide, which shows a list of senses. And as I say, congenital deafblindness increasingly involves problems with the perception of all these senses. So we have vision, hearing, and touch. And then we have proprioception, which I will talk about in more detail in a moment, temperature, People forget that our ability to perceive temperature, to feel hot and cold, is a sensory input, just like our ability to see and our ability to hear. Pain is a sensory input. And again, people often don't realize that. And many of the children I've worked with deafblindness have difficulties with perception of pain. Often they don't seem to perceive pain very effectively until it gets particularly intense, or they find all kinds of fairly ordinary things quite painful. So they are oversensitive to pain. Then there's the vestibular sense, which I'll talk about in more detail, and then smell and taste. And we've all been to school, and we all learned that there are 5 senses: vision, hearing, touch, smell, and taste. And a big message today is no, no, no. And when you see something like this advertisement for Turkish Airlines, and it tells you to see, hear, taste, smell, touch, explore Istanbul, widen your world. It's a tourist advert, but they only talk about the 5 conventional senses. And I saw this poster at an airport and I instantly thought, no, 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 no. I wanted to go up and add proprioception and vestibular to the list, because there are far more than 5 senses. And today I will explain why proprioception and vestibular senses are so important. Here is a diagram, and it's called the pyramid of learning. And you can find this idea in various diagrammatic forms. I particularly like this one. At the bottom, you have the central nervous system, or the brain. And then as you go up the pyramid, you go from the basics, the fundamental foundation of learning, looking at a process of learning that ends in academic learning. The top of the pyramid is the Valhalla, the El Dorado of education, academic learning. And unfortunately, a lot of important people in the world of education, administrators and politicians, think that education is only about academic learning. And they have very little idea of all these other things which need to happen first if the child is going to be available for academic learning. So let's start at the bottom. And you see the bottom level, the foundation is sensory systems. And you need sensory systems, otherwise there will be no learning whatsoever. The brain is like a prisoner trapped in your skull, and the brain doesn't know anything unless the senses send information into it. And if for some reason the senses are missing, or if they're not working very well, or if they're only sending partial information, or if they're only working very slowly, so the information is taking a remarkably long time to get to the brain, then the brain is not going to have a full idea of where it is, where the body is, what the body is doing, and what's happening around the body. But if you look at the sensory systems in the diagram, you'll see 3 of them are on the bottom, and the others are on the next level. And touch, vestibular, and proprioception are on the bottom because they are the most fundamentally important. All the senses are important, but those 3 provide the base for smell, vision, hearing, and taste to develop effectively, especially vision and hearing. And if touch, vestibular, and proprioception senses are not working effectively, if there isn't good function in them, we need to spend time helping the child's perception in those senses improve in order to help their functional vision and functional hearing improve. There is a direct link. And you don't only improve a child's hearing by working on their ears and their auditory system. You can improve their hearing by also working on these other senses. You can improve their auditory attention, especially by improving the working of those fundamental senses, and the same with vision. And then the diagram goes from the senses up to sensory motor development, things like reflexes maturing, the ability to habituate sensory input and ignore it, the ability to develop good postural security, which can be very slow and very difficult for a lot of our children. Then you go up to perceptual motor development, things like hand-eye coordination, controlling the eyes effectively, auditory language skills developing. And then you get to the top, which is cognition and intellect. And at the very top, you have academic learning. And it's a nice way in a diagram of thinking about the fact of just how important the senses are to everything we're doing. And I'm just skipping forward. Let me see. Yeah, I'll talk more about proprioception in the next webinar, but I'll talk about it here. The proprioceptive sense helps us to plan, position, and grade our movements. It tells us where our body is and what our body is doing all the time from moment to moment. The receptors are based in the muscles and the joints all through the body. And they are triggered, the sensory input through this sense is triggered by three things: by any sort of compression or pressure, any sort of stretching, and any kind of twisting of a joint. So compression, stretching, twisting. Anything that does any of those three things to part of our body instantly sends a proprioceptive message to the brain, telling the brain that's what's happening to that part of the body. And in this way, the proprioceptive sense makes sure that our brain knows where all our body parts are and what they're doing. And if I said to you now, your left ankle, your brain could feel your left ankle even before I said left ankle. But the moment I said those words, you stopped habituating that feeling and it came to the front of your brain. I enhanced that awareness, and you probably moved that ankle because by moving it, by flexing it a little, you increase the proprioceptive information coming to your brain. And you know exactly where it is. Well, of course, you know where your left ankle is anyway, because you've had a lifetime of normal proprioceptive perception. But for many of the children we work with, it isn't working very effectively. It goes wrong for a variety of reasons. An orthopedic injury, significant orthopedic surgery, anything that cuts muscles, that breaks bones, and those kinds of injuries and interventions can impede proprioceptive functioning coming to the brain. Arthritis means that you can't feel those parts of the body. And we use the word feel, but we're not talking about touch. We're not talking about touching your left ankle. We're talking about feeling it without touching it, because your proprioceptive sense internally gives you the feeling of where the ankle is. If there's cerebral palsy or other kinds of brain damage, or actually if there's any kind of abnormal muscle tone, our muscle tone needs to be flexible so that we can move. If your muscles are too stiff and tight or too floppy and loose, Or if you can only be stiff and tight or floppy and loose, you're not going to feel your body proprioceptively very effectively. Proprioception works best if there is a normal range of muscle tone. The best way we can simulate this as a problem is poor circulation. We talk about a leg going to sleep. You know, you sit on your leg watching television, the doorbell rings, and you've cut off circulation, so you don't feel the leg very effectively. And you have to give your leg a lot of proprioceptive input. Stamp the foot, shake the leg around, bang it hard with your hands, lots of deep pressure to get the circulation going. And lack of use. If the child isn't moving, if the child tends to be very stationary for all sorts of reasons, which wouldn't be uncommon in young children with deafblindness, they need stimulation through the proprioceptive and vestibular senses. Otherwise, like all our senses, the receptors will atrophy and ultimately will die, and that they won't be revivable. So we really need to make sure, and this is where therapists come in very strongly, make sure that there is sensory input coming through. You may find that if a child has a reluctance to be face down, say on the floor or on a couch, if they prefer to be on their back, it may be that they don't have the muscle tone to avoid being squished face first into the floor. And equally, if you try and lift them and get them to bear weight on their legs, you may get a very aversive response. They're not feeling their body very effectively, so those positions are very threatening. They may look lazy because children with poor proprioceptive perception tend to lean and prop a lot. And this may be common all the way through childhood and into adulthood. I've got a whole range of photos of children propping and leaning, especially to support the head, because it's very, very challenging for them to do otherwise. They may well stamp the feet when they're walking. Sometimes they walk on high tippy toe, which tightens all the muscles in the feet. If I was in the room with you now, I would get you all up on tippy toe so you could feel proprioceptively what happens to your feet, your calves, your thighs, and your butt when you go up onto tiptoe. And the moment you do it, you understand why some children might choose tippy toe walking. Not because it's an orthopedic problem, which is quite different, but it's an active choice to give their brain a better sense of where their feet and their legs are. They may be physically very clumsy. They may use too much force or too little force when they're using their hands or their feet. And people may think they're being aggressive, where actually they just don't know how to grade the amount of force. So they may hold things too tight, or they may not hold them tightly enough. And then the last point, sensory diet, seeking strong pressure or stretching or twisting inputs. And I've given some common examples: squeezing into tight spaces, crossing or twisting the limbs around each other, sometimes like I'm doing I can't do it very well, but in very complex, flexible ways. Twisting a foot or a leg around the leg of a chair, binding body parts with cloth or string or rubber bands, pulling on the teeth and the lower jaw, grinding the teeth. People don't realize that grinding the teeth is one of the strongest forms of proprioceptive stimulation that we can give ourselves. Those muscles can provide massive pressure, and grinding the teeth can fulfill a whole range of functions, and I'll come back to that today. Tapping on the teeth with hard objects. I've already mentioned hand flapping. Sometimes it could be hand clapping. Think of the stretching and compression and twisting in all your fingers, your hands, and your wrists when you really flap your hands hard. There's a lot of proprioceptive information being created. Legs swinging, kicking things hard, hanging from a bar, and so on. All these behaviors are seen very commonly. Sometimes they're almost obsessive in that the child does them all the time. Sometimes they're much more subtle. And sometimes in older children and adults, they're very subtle indeed, but if you know what to look for, you can spot them. And they're all part of what I call sensory diet. So, you know, you're getting a message, I'm into sensory diet big time, and I'm observing for it. And when I meet older children and especially adults with deafblindness, I like to talk to them about these issues. And it's surprising how much, when I really question them, how do you manage to sit down backwards into a chair? They think about it. They say, well, I just sit down, and then they think about it and they realize they, by themselves, they've developed strategies to be able to position themselves in the chair, turn around, feel the chair, sit partially down, but not relax until the pressure on the back of their legs is firm enough to give them the signal to sit back. And then the first thing they do is look for the back of the chair with their back to make sure it's there. And if we think about self-stimulation and think about posture, both before and after walking has been mastered. We commonly see postures. For my own sake, I've tried to separate them into these issues. Postures involving the head, the legs, bending and stretching, hanging, the hands, planking, propping, squeezing, and climbing. And I'm going to show you a lot of pictures, and I'll talk about, you know, what I think these pictures mean. And this is always the point where in my presentations, when people in the audience, especially parents, but also a lot of teachers and therapists, say to me afterwards, God, you showed my child in those pictures. You know, these behaviors are seen commonly because we're all human beings and because we all have these needs. So this was a big aha moment for me, this boy. He came to one of our family picnics. He was completely blind and profoundly deaf. He was about 12 years old, I think. Very low muscle tone, no receptive or expressive language. He hadn't been well taught, and very low affect. His mother has got him standing, and she's held him partially up, walked him to this swing, and taken his hand and put it down on the swing. The boy is shuffling his feet along the floor. He's not lifting his feet. And the boy has retracted his hand and yelled and dropped to the floor and curled up in a ball. His mother has sighed and walked away, and instantly the boy has brought his hand up, located the swing, pulled himself up, gone over the swing so that his belly is on the swing. Then with his hands on the floor and his feet on the floor, he's moved his body back and forth on the swing till the swing is in exactly the right place. And he's pushing with his feet to work out when the swing is in the right place. And once he knows he's balanced and everything is okay, he pulls one arm out of the sleeve of his t-shirt and he jams it in the other sleeve. So he has two arms in one sleeve. And when everything is in place, he sighs. And then he pushes with his feet and he's achieved exactly what he wants, which is to give himself a very easy, very safe amount of vestibular stimulation with some tactile and proprioceptive stuff attached. Now, it's easy to look at this and think it's crazy. And this is the kind of thing, people see this sometimes and they think it's autistic. They think it shows emotional disturbance. They think it shows ADHD, you know, all those behavioral labels. But if you take a multisensory perspective, what this boy is doing, everything I've just described, he's looking for strong proprioceptive input. Right from the beginning, right through to the end when he jams to, what do you get if you jam two arms in one sleeve and you can't get your arm very far because it's too tight? You get deep pressure from the sleeve on your arms, and your brain then has a much better idea where your arms are and that they're where you want them to be, and that's important. Everything, I don't just know where everything is now, but it's all where I want it to be, and it's safe. I'm fixed, I'm not going to fall. This was one of the great moments for me, 2006, I see it was. And this boy then went through a revolutionary change in educational placement. There was a whole range of things initiated: horse riding, hydrotherapy, swimming. He gets an OT evaluation. The OT did a brilliant evaluation. He's wearing a pressure vest. He gets deep pressure massage twice a day at school. He's also wearing pressure cuffs around his elbows and knees. And as a result, his body awareness has improved massively from where it was 12 months ago. And as a result, he isn't so switched off. He isn't so fixated on his own in-body sensations. He isn't working hard to increase awareness of where his body is, because we're doing that for him through all the things I just mentioned. And as you can see in the picture, he's now available for social interaction with the outside world, even though he still can't see and he's still not tolerating hearing aids. Here's a teenager I met a few years ago. She was born very prematurely. She's almost completely blind, profoundly deaf. She's doing orientation and mobility with the white cane. And when she gets to the bark, which you see on the floor, she knows, this is at school, she knows there's a swing there, and that's the time when she has a rest to reorganize her system. And she gives the cane to someone, she gets on the swing, and she gets in this extraordinary position. And again, it's easy to look at this and say, wow, she's so autistic. Wow, she's so retarded. I mean, people use these labels even if they don't say them anymore. She's so emotionally disturbed. She's so crazy. She's so weird. This is unimportant. How can we stop her doing this? People say. And I always say, what does it mean? Because if you haven't worked out what it means, how dare you start working on ideas to stop her doing it? It's not damaging to her. She's not doing this for hours at a time, but she is unwittingly, she's sending out a very clear message. I need a lot more proprioceptive inputs. I probably need more vestibular inputs as well. I would like to see more of that built into my day, because it will help me with the academic curriculum that I'm also following. Here's a boy who's being pump fed at one of our picnics. You can see the feeding tube. And the one ankle up on the other knee is a classic way that children improve their feelings of security, physical security, that they're not going to fall. Here's another child doing it, not just one ankle up on the other knee, but the lower leg braced against the wall for deep pressure. Here's some remarkable leg twisting while they're in the hammock swing. This is a classic posture if the child wants to relax. If you don't know where your body is, you're probably not going to relax very easily. You work out strategies to confirm where your body is, I think primarily to know that you're physically safe and you're not going to fall. And the children discover, and we have no idea how, they discover all by themselves that if they bring one ankle up on the other knee, they know where their lower body is and they don't need to worry about it. Here's a young adult. I presented like this in Canada, and a mom sent me this picture of her son, and she said, he has cerebral palsy and very low vision. Every time he goes in the wheelchair, he brings one ankle up on the other knee. He never does it any other time. We've never understood why, and now we know. If it's a wheelchair and he's moving, he needs extra confirmation that his body is stable and fixed, and he's done it all by himself. Here's a child who can't stand and bear weight on her legs, but she can stand on 2 feet and her head very effectively. We need to remember that young children, when they're developing in a normal way, give themselves a lot of vestibular and proprioceptive input. And once they're mobile, the amount of input they give themselves increases massively. Think of a typically developing 2-year-old, how they run, how they jump, how they climb on the couch and jump off. And where you or I would jump off and bend the ankles and bend the knees, they land with the ankles and knees locked. They want to maximize the pressure. They want more and more proprioceptive and vestibular input. If the child at that age can't bear weight because it's too dangerous, it's a very unstable position, they often find other ways of giving their body that input very powerfully. And we need to know what they're doing and why they're doing it. Here's a much younger baby. Here's a child head standing against a child gate. I have so many pictures of these postures. Here's an older child who's one of your state superstars. This is him, I would guess, given that he's got a chewy in his mouth, so he's getting deep pressure from biting down on it, but he's also head standing with his feet very effectively maintaining postural security. This is a way of reorganizing the system, of either waking himself up or calming himself down. I've just seen in the chat box, somebody is asking if the slides will be shared. I did say at the beginning, I gave my email address. I'll give it at the end, and I can send the slideshow. I can't send the photographs, but I think most of you don't need these photos because you know children who are doing all this stuff all the time. These are not that uncommon. And I would guess this young man is either calming himself down or waking himself up, or both simultaneously. Here's a young man, there's a TV and there's a TV table. There's a narrow shelf at the bottom and he's jamming himself in. This is a kid in England, actually. His mom sent me this picture and she said, "We don't understand this. The shelf is so narrow, he doesn't fit. He has to work so hard to jam himself in." And somebody told me, you know why he's doing it. And I wrote back and I said, if that shelf was 2 inches higher, he wouldn't be in there. He's doing it in order to get compressed. He's either waking himself up or calming himself down. He's getting his systems reoriented. And here's a young lady come home after a day at school. School is very challenging for these children. We tend to push them too, even the best of us expect too much. And I always say, when everything's going well, when the child is really attending and learning, when our adaptations and modifications are just perfect, we are at our most dangerous because we're likely to go too far, too fast, too often. And sometimes the child might have to let us know very forcibly, that's what we've done. And this young lady, she's come home, she empties the toy box, she's functioning, she's very active, but she needs that sense of compression and containment as a self-regulation behavior. And very quickly, that was proprioception. I do a whole day on these two senses, so you really are getting a very condensed version. But if you look at the resource list that you have, there are 2 articles by me, one about the proprioceptive sense and one about the vestibular sense. There's also a host of other articles, but you can find more information. This is the sense that tells us about head position and head movement. It tells us which way is up, which is the opposite of where gravity is pulling. It detects head motion, and it has a big link and impact with vision and proprioception. And the receptors are located in the inner ears on both sides of the head. And here you see a diagram which shows if in a normal ear, this is what you should find on both sides of the head in the inner ear. Very small, very fragile. At the top, you've got the cochlea. It looks like a snail shell. And then at the bottom, you've got 2 bulbs and then 3 curved semicircular canals. And the cochlea is the organ of hearing. Everything else is the vestibular apparatus. And just like the cochlea, all of these things are hollow, and as I said, very fragile. They're filled with fluid, and the insides of them are lined with nerve hairs. And it's movement of the fluid moves the nerve hairs. And in the cochlea, that movement is conveyed to the brain as electrical energy and is how we hear. In the vestibular apparatus, as the head moves, the fluid swirls around, and the movement of the nerve hairs tell the brain what the head is doing. Not just that it's moving, but how fast it's moving and what direction it's moving. And for many reasons, lots of children with deafblindness, this vestibular apparatus is not working properly. I'm sorry, the toxic smoke of California is really getting to me this morning. My eyes are watering and now I'm starting to cough. You'll have to forgive the coughing. There are wonderful quotes about how important this is, but I've got a quote from Jean Ayres, the occupational therapist. The vestibular system is the unifying system. All other types of sensation are processed in reference to this basic vestibular information. The activity in the vestibular system provides a framework for the other aspects of our experience. So this is the most important of all the senses. And if this is not working properly, if this is missing, as it is for some children, all our other sensory systems will have difficulty developing and working, even if they are perfect. Even if the child has normal eyes and normal hearing and a normal auditory system and a normal visual system, they will have some hearing and vision problems because their vestibular sense is missing or damaged. When you look at why children have vestibular disorders, it's quite scary because it's a huge list. So if there's head or neck trauma, particularly during birth or at some point after birth, say from an automobile accident or something like that, that can result in vestibular dysfunction. Chronic ear infections. Many of you may have had an ear infection which causes temporary vestibular dysfunction. Your balance goes off and maybe your vision is affected. If the ear infections are not treated, in the end, both the cochlea and the vestibular apparatus can be permanently damaged, which is why we do want those ear infections detected and treated quickly. If there was maternal drug or alcohol abuse during the pregnancy, if the mother was infected with cytomegalovirus during the pregnancy, this can cause a number of birth defects, including damage to the vestibular apparatus. Meningitis infection can cause the damage. Migraine can cause temporary vestibular dysfunction. And again, many of you may have migraines with vestibular dysfunction. And we think migraine in a population like Charge syndrome, for example, we think migraine is perhaps much more common than we used to think it was. Certain metabolic disorders like diabetes, if they're not treated over time, there can be permanent vestibular damage. Ototoxic drugs, ironically, which are treated for meningitis infection, they can actually save life, but damage the inner ear. If there's a posterior brain tumor, which is where vestibular input is processed in the brain, certain neurological disorders like cerebral palsy and hydrocephalus can result in vestibular disorders. Certain syndromes, Wallenberg syndrome, Usher type 1, and the big one is Charge syndrome. We think almost everybody with Charge has vestibular damage. Even if it doesn't show on a scan, we think there's vestibular damage. So that needs to be understood and it needs to be dealt with. If there's a family history of vestibular issues, there's a little bit of evidence of cochlear implants when they're switched on. The child develops vestibular problems, which they didn't have before. But there's also a little bit of evidence of children with vestibular disorder having a cochlear implant switched on and the vestibular function improves a little bit. So it's, you know, it's very hard to predict exactly what's going to happen when an implant is switched on. And like I said about proprioception, lack of use for anxiety, because of low vision, because of fear of falling and in ill health, are all going to play a part. And let me think, what am I saying here? If there are significant vestibular problems, they will adversely affect a lot of things. The organization of all sensory information from all the other senses. Obviously, postural security and muscle tone. Use of vision will be affected. I'll talk about that much more tomorrow when I'm doing a webinar about Charge syndrome tomorrow morning, and I'll go into more detail on vision. Reception and processing of sound, remembering auditory sequences and visual sequences. You can see now how big this is in a child who perhaps already has a hearing loss and a visual impairment. Memory development, implications for speech and language development, difficulties with the development of bilateral coordination, all kinds of behavioral challenges. By definition, things like breathing, feeding, digestion, and nutrition could be impacted. Sociability will be impacted. These children don't like being picked up right from birth. You can get a very, very aversive response to being lifted and carried. So they may need to be lifted and carried in a very physically contained way, and moved in a particular way, either sideways or head first, or with bouncing, and all those kind of strategies you need to explore child by child. And finally, self-regulation. The sense that plays the biggest part in helping us develop good self-regulation is the vestibular sense. And it's no surprise that the children with Charge have the highest level of vestibular dysfunction, and children with Charge tend to have the highest level of self-regulation difficulties. How to remain calm but alert, whatever's happening. And I'll talk a lot more about that in the future and in other webinars. Let's think about the physical things. How do we achieve balance or equilibrium? People often call the vestibular sense the balance sense, but that isn't strictly true. Balance comes from the eyes, the muscles and the joints, and the vestibular organs. So really it's three senses working and developing together. And that's good news, because it means if the child has low vision, and if they have major vestibular dysfunction, we can work a lot on their proprioceptive perception, along with touch and tactile input. Any work that we do to improve a child's functional vision contributes to the development of balance. You know, vision teachers often don't realize that if the child isn't standing and walking yet, their work on improving visual attention and visual functioning is contributing one day to standing and walking. It isn't only the physical therapists who do that. It extends much further and includes working on vision and auditory perception. And one of the big breakthroughs in the world of charge syndrome in the last few years has been discovering the effectiveness of hiking poles for children from quite an early age. I talked about hiking poles in a presentation. I saw an adult using them, and then I saw a teenager using them, talked to the parents and thought, I'll present about this. And I had some pictures from England of a girl with them. And that girl was a teenager. She'd never walked independently. She always had to hold on to someone. She was given hiking poles, and from that day on, she never held on to anybody when she was walking, as long as she had the hiking poles. This young lady is obviously much younger. I talked about hiking poles in Texas last year, and a few weeks later, a mother who was in the audience sent me this photo and said, it's fabulous. She's not only walking independently, but she's walking on all kinds of uneven ground. The problem is she's an ASL user, and she can't express with these. So you have to then explore ways of perhaps using the wrist straps or saving up the communication till you can park here. So it's not an ideal solution, but it can be very effective. And of course, walking totally independently has a huge impact on a child's self-image and independence. I'll say a little more about vision and the vestibular sense. I'll say a lot more, actually, because it's important. There are very close links for a number of different reasons. And one of the things we need to remember is vision is a totally directional sense. You can hear things all around you. You can smell things all around you, but you can't see things all around you. The eyes have to be moved and oriented in order for them to see particular things. And that means that if you're going to be able to move your eyes around effectively and efficiently, you need to have good control, not just of your eyes, but of your head and your trunk and your whole body. And if your body is wobbling and moving around, your eyes are going to do the same, and functional vision will be challenged. So many children, if we look at their posture, what you discover is they are fixing the body and the head in order to facilitate using vision. And there is a particular reflex called the vestibulo-ocular reflex. And what this says, this is a clinical definition. I won't read it because you may not understand it. Basically, if I look at you, I can stay looking at you while I move my head. I'm looking at Jennifer, the interpreter, and my eyes are moving all over the place, and I'm looking at her the whole time because I have a vestibular sense which is working. And it's my vestibular sense that enables my head to move while my eyes stay in place. So when I turn my head to the left, my eyes are in a way turning to the right in order to stay in the same position and look at Jennifer. If my vestibular system is not working, when I move my head to the left, my eyes go with it, and I've lost Jennifer, and then I have to look for her and find her again. And so often we see children adapting their posture in order to compensate for that problem. And I've got, again, lots of pictures, classic behavior. Oh, there's a book, I want to look at the book. I take the book, I get on the floor, I roll onto my back, I bring one ankle up on the other knee to fix my body so my brain knows I'm safe, and then my brain can just focus on functional vision. And it's a tiring posture because she's having to hold the book up high, but it works. Here's a much older child. This is taken from above, looking down. His feet are on the back of the couch. He's more or less upside down, legs tightly crossed, and he's using his thumbs on his tablet very effectively. He can't do this sitting on a chair at a table. It's so important to stress that. Here's one of my favorite photos. This is a smart kid. He's on a couch. He's on his knees and his hands, but his forehead is resting on the arm of the couch. And he's found a perfect way to stabilize the head to keep everything in place. Here's a child flat on his back. He's holding his tablet between his toes. His legs are extended. And like I keep saying, these look crazy, but they are adaptive, functional behaviors. We've got to keep coming back to meaning. What does this mean? What is this child telling me? And it's no good going in with an assessment that says, can the child do this, 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 and this? There's a place for that, but maybe that's not the best way to start. A lot of the behaviors we see are a way of answering the question, where is my head? The vestibular sense tells us where our head is and what our head is doing. And we see things like repetitive head weaving, binding the head with a tight hat or a scarf, holding the head, tapping the head, pressing the head against things, clenching the jaw, grinding the teeth, biting and chewing. So a lot of this kind of behavior, here's a child with a plastic bucket, not just on their head, but pulled tight on their head. And here's a commercial product, a kerchief, specifically for the child to bite on, rather than doing it on their own clothing. And I think we often see children who like to have something in their mouth to bite on. It's often called oral stimulation, but I think very often it's proprioceptive stimulation. I think obviously there's oral tactile input, but I think often they're not just putting things in their mouth, but they're clenching the teeth on those things. And it can be very effective way of helping them balance, especially when they're sitting or standing and walking. And I've seen children who can walk after a fashion fairly safely if they are biting on something. You ask them to take that kerchief or that ribbon or that chewy out of their mouth, they can't walk. They either can't walk or their walking gait falls apart because they've lost that focus on where is my head. And as long as I'm clenching my teeth, I can just go. And they very often fixate their vision on a target ahead and they hold on with their vision and move towards it. And if we're putting in a lot of work to stop them biting on things, we have to remember that we may have to compensate for those things.
What did I do? Getting bigger.
And here are some of the commercially produced chewies. I'm sure you're familiar with these. The Chewies used to be very stereotypical. They were a T shape, and they got to be too stigmatizing. And now there's a range of beautifully produced, colored, shaped stuff. And what the message is in these behaviors, very much from the children, is you fix your body to fix the head, to fix the eyes, so you can use your vision in the best, most reliable, and most comfortable way. And I hope that was help. Now, I know I'm talking ostensibly about assessment. Actually, everything I've said today is about assessment, but it's not about assessment schedules. It's not about assessment checklists. It's a different idea of assessment based on close observation of children. And somebody again is asking for a copy of the slides. I will make them available to people. And you're right, there is so much information. There's actually too much information, but there you go. But you will get the slideshow. But don't forget, you also have the resource list, and there's even more information there. So if you fish through it, especially my articles will back up the things I'm saying. Now I've got like 3 hours more of slides and 25 minutes. So let me think. Self-stimulation. You will get the slides, but I'm going to talk a little bit about self-stimulation to try and get through this. I think self-stimulation is a dirty word if you put a hyphen in it. Very often in my long career, I go into school and people would ask me very quickly, oh, she self-stimulates a lot. She self-stimulates too much. All she does is self-stimulate. We'd like ideas to help to stop her self-stimulating. And my answer always is, what does the self-stimulation mean? And very often people can't answer that question because they haven't understood that self-stimulation has meaning, and that self-stimulation is universal, and that self-stimulation is functional, and that often as they're talking to me, they are self-stimulating. They may be going from foot to foot. They may have like a necklace, and they may well be, you know, pulling the necklace. They may well be twisting their hair around the finger or pulling on their earlobe. Or they may be, you know, rubbing their chin as I'm talking. All of those things are self-stimulation. Self-stimulation isn't just grinding the teeth, flapping the hands, or rocking. It covers anything we do to ourselves that creates sensory input to our brains. And that covers an awful lot. And you can look at your friends. Again, if I was in the room with you, by now I would have noticed who in the room plays with their earlobe, who crosses the legs and then bounces them up and down, who takes their ballpoint pen and does a little bit of clicking, all those kinds of behaviors, just to make the point that self-stimulation is really important. And I'm not saying that self-stimulation can't be damaging. I'm not saying it can be a serious obstacle to learning, but I really think we need to go back to where did this behavior come from and why did it start? And it always starts as a self-stimulation behavior, looking for input for a particular reason. And I think if the behavior is dangerous or illegal, we obviously have to intervene very quickly. If it isn't dangerous or illegal, we need to spend time saying, what does this mean? And it might mean that what we're teaching isn't relevant. It might mean that what we're teaching is boring, and that wouldn't be unlikely. It might mean that we push the child too far or too long. It might mean that we haven't done the necessary preparation work to get the child in a good place for attention. After the break, I'm doing a webinar talking about availability for learning. And the two webinars fit together, and they even overlap a bit. But sensory inputs are very powerful. You can, I mean, we all know from our own childhood and maybe from your parenting, if you swing a child too much, they vomit. I mean, you can induce life-threatening issues by administering sensory input too much, too strongly. So these are powerful inputs, and we can organize sensory inputs to children in a way that contributes positively to their arousal level. We know instinctively that if a young child is going to bed, we don't want to bring their arousal level higher and higher. We don't want to play tickling and running and swinging and bouncing games, or we shouldn't, because that is going to reduce the chance of them going to bed and falling asleep. And so on. We do that all through life with ourselves and everyone, but we can do it with more thought with children with deafblindness. And sometimes it just means a little movement exercise before a lesson. Like if you're going to sit for 25 minutes and do math or literacy or listening, following a story, maybe before you get in the chair, you can walk around the block, or maybe you can do some physical exercises. Maybe you can do some jumping and your hand clapping above the head and twisting to the left and right. Doing those things may well get the child in a better place in terms of arousal in order to sit down and focus for what could be quite a challenging period of time. Preparation for attending should be on the agenda for all of us in our teaching. I now have 20 minutes. Thank you. Some of you have posted saying this is very useful, and that you don't all have to post now, but it's really helpful for me because it's very strange sitting in my bedroom doing this and reminding myself that you're all in Indiana or other places, and I'm not there. I know I'm not there, but so observing how and when a child self-stimulates will offer invaluable insights into who they are and how they work for assessment, teaching, behavior management, and relationship building. It's big. And here are some more children. Butt on the couch, head and arms kind of backwards on the floor, and the child is looking at a book, and the child is looking at the book. It's extraordinary, but we can explore why this works best for the child. It puts their brain in touch with the body so powerfully that the brain cannot worry about the body. Now, of course, if I got in that position, my brain would worry about my body amazingly because I'd injure myself because I couldn't maintain the position. But it really is important to think in terms of the child, not us. And yes, I don't want this kid in this position for hours every day, but at the moment, I have to work out why is this working well at the moment. Here's somebody in a doctor's waiting room. He's planking across the arms of the chairs because there's no space where he can lay smoothly. And this is a classic stress relief posture. Here's a very young child, one ankle up on the other knee. Here's a child gone to sleep. And at this age, not only did she need one ankle up on the other knee, but she needed both hands back. Massive proprioceptive input. They're stretching and twisting. And there's another one. And here's one of my favorites. Not the hands interwoven, but the toes interwoven. So this is at an appointment, some kind of medical appointment. How can you tell where your feet are and your legs are that you're okay in this strange chair? Well, why not interlink your feet? And of course, that's easier said than done. especially if you're me or most of you, I would anticipate. So I'm going to end up, so nobody says I didn't formally talk about assessment. I'm skipping a lot of slides, but you can have the slide show. And I'm just reading some longer comments. So that's good. That's good. Great. Wonderful. Why do people assess children with deaf? And if I was there with you, you could give me the reasons and I'd write them down. And I think we'll move on. This is in the reading list that you have. It's over 10 years old now, but it's really good. If you want a commercially available assessment material, this booklet, Assessing Communication and Learning in Young Children who are deaf-blind or who have multiple disabilities, what it does, it takes the 12 most popular assessment tools for children with deafblindness in the United States. They did a survey and they picked the 12 most popular tools, some of which were specific for deafblindness. Most of them weren't. They were from other fields of special education. And then they tell you what they are, who developed them, what population they were designed for, and then they do a little critique of each one. And they tell you what they think is good about it and useful, what they think isn't so good. So I would recommend it. You can download it free, but it also has a great introduction. There's a whole section on ideas for assessment for parents, ideas for teachers, ideas for school psychologists, and I think ideas for social workers. I'm not sure, but it's a very useful booklet. And I've got slides that talk about the challenges. Let me see. Will I show this? No, you kind of know this stuff. And slides about why things go wrong. And think about clues, hypothetical children. Think about when a child does something crazy, how you could make it like useful and meaningful in your own mind. Flapping the hands, understanding spoken English, but preferring to sign back rather than speaking. And that, people find that a bit crazy, or they think the child's being difficult, because those people think we talk with our ears, and they're forgetting that speech depends on an awful lot, not just on hearing. You know, yes, if you can't hear a language, you're not likely to speak it, but there are all sorts of other issues. Often getting flat on the back on the floor, walking on tiptoe more and more as the school day progresses, adopting extreme and unusual positions, always removing hearing aids in the bathroom. You know, these give you all sorts of ideas. And when I did this as a whole day earlier this year, I put more pictures in. Any of you know children who do this? Ordering and lining up. My world is chaotic. My world is hard to predict. My world is very confusing. I will find ways to impose order, and that will help my arousal level. It will help me to relax. It will help me to feel good about myself. If you can look at children's behavior and think about them as a human being, it could be very helpful. And here's another child, and I have lots of pictures of these, ordering and lining things up. And then in conclusion of this section, why is all this important? I think if you take this approach, this real multisensory approach to children, to your way of assessing, it helps you to understand their challenges. I've seen adults or older teens who are following an academic curriculum. They're probably going to go to university. And I look at them and I think, boy, this young man has significant vestibular issues. He's adapting really well and compensating. And then when you talk to him or the teacher or his parents, nobody's ever addressed vestibular problems because nobody's ever said this boy has vestibular issues. And the young man says, oh, well, I cross my legs like that because it helps me to hear, or it helps me to see the book better. And so I'm not just talking about children at the very early stage of development. I'm not just talking about older children who are still at early developmental stages. These kind of things go right through life because we never regrow semicircular canals. We never regrow a retina at the back of the eye. I mean, if those things are wrong, they're wrong for life. And we can compensate with technology and medical input, but we need to be aware these challenges could be there for life. It helps us to gain a more accurate idea of their needs. It helps us to appreciate their adaptive behaviors. And for me, this is most important for the family. If you take this view, you actually get to know the child. You really get to know that child. And then you're in a much better position to introduce the essential child to other people. And yes, we've all been in a situation where a parent will say, oh, my child's very smart. And you see professionals in the room looking a little uncomfortable because it's like, well, the child obviously isn't smart. If the parent can say why they think that, then they're in a much stronger position to get that message across. We expect parents to think their child is smart, but if they can give us reasons why they've come to that conclusion. And a lot of my work, when I was working, a lot of my work went into helping parents and teachers describe the child more powerfully and more effectively, to describe the child's abilities, to get away from deficit views and talk about abilities. There's a question. I assume this is being recorded as a video, Lisa, because it says, can we share the video?
Yeah. Yes, I was sending that to you. I record all of them, but I know you're concerned about your photos, and I can make sure that they're unidentifiable if that makes you feel better about those.
If you could, that would be very helpful.
Okay.
Yeah. In which case, I don't need to send you the slideshow. If you could do that.
Yeah, I can do that. It'll take a little longer, but that means for people who have asked me in the chat box, we will be posting it then up on our website and our YouTube channel. So you can go back and see the parts that you've missed.
Yeah, okay. I don't know how to block out the children's faces, or I would do that myself. So thank you. So yes, you will get a filmed version of the talk, which I will never watch because it's always too embarrassing. There is a great book by Jan van Dijk, Child Guided Strategies, the Van Dijk Approach. I have slides coming up, which I don't have time to show you, which talk about his approach. And really, it's what I've been pushing hard. I mean, he had a huge impact on me back in the 80s. And I think, like all of us, who are the masters we follow? Who are the gurus we identify with? It's the people who are recommending what we're already doing, but they're doing it with a lot more insight and a lot more organizational ability and a lot more understanding. And when the first time I heard Lily Nielsen and Jan van Dijk, it just fits so well with my view of children, but I didn't have the vocabulary and the ideology really, and the methodology that they gave me. So there is information about Van Dijk and about a teacher in Texas called Robbie Blaha. There's an old article by me on the list. Actually, I wrote it in England in 97 and we reprinted it in California. I said that when I meet a child, I have 4 assessment questions at the beginning. How do you feel? What do you like? What do you want? What do you do? And I probably don't ask the child verbally, but in my mind and in my conversation with the family or the teacher, I talk about how is she feeling today? Is this a good day? Is this a fairly typical morning? Or was she awake all night? Is she ill at the moment? That, just to set that first. And then what does she like? Because I'm a teacher, I want motivators. I want to use what children like so that they'll enjoy being with me. Because as a high school history teacher, I had to do stuff children didn't like, and I had big problems, and those children weren't deafblind. So identifying motivators. What do you want? In other words, what range of expressive behavior does the child have? Even if they don't express with the language, do they eye point? Do they gesture and point? Can they tap you if they want you? Can they go to the door and take your hand and put it on the door? Do they have those kind of expressive behaviors that show communicative intent? And then the most important question, what do you do? And that's what I've been talking about all morning. What can you do comes next. And that's the that's the teacher question we're all very good at. We all want to stretch the child to get a baseline. We want the threshold of their ability so we get a teaching point. But before we push them and test them and get to the baseline, we should first say, not what can you do, but what do you do when you're all by yourself? What information are you giving me just by sitting in that chair, lying on the floor, walking around the room, running in the garden, all that kind of stuff? That might be more valuable than the assessment information you get when you get all your materials and you sit the child in a chair at a table and you start to do a more structured assessment. And I'm not knocking structured assessment or formal assessment. I'm not knocking assessment tools, but I do think we jump in there too quickly. And I think getting an idea of what children do could get us in a really good place. So one of the most important early assessment questions we can ask is, what do you do? And what can you do should come a little bit later, if we have the time. I've got to end, and I can't remember how this ends. I have so much material here that I just couldn't take out. So let me see. Just to give you an idea, I talked about preparation. I've got 2 slides of ideas, and these won't come as a surprise to you, but any activities which improve muscle tone and controlled movement and improve the connection of the body with the brain that I've talked about. Things like Tai Chi, yoga, climbing, dancing, and whatever's appropriate for the child, with adaptations maybe. Deep pressure inputs, things like jumping, deep pressure massage, swimming, horse riding would be another one to put on the list. Binding the skin, a therapist might recommend a spandex pressure vest or something like that. Good physical support and appropriate postures for efficient functioning. When I'm assessing children, I often, if I'm looking at hearing and vision, I often work with them flat on their back. If that's a favorite position and it's where they like to be, that's where I'm going to get the best visual and auditory functioning. They don't have to be upright on their mom's lap or in a chair. I probably want to assess them there as well. But if I'm looking for them, their absolute best auditory and visual functioning, it's going to be in the best position for them. And that could be flat on the back or side lying. It could be standing. It just depends. But we need to make sure it's the best for them. Lots of variety in postures and movement. Horse riding is great because there's constant variety, but the child might need to move. Rest periods for reorganization. And remember that for these children, rest periods could be rest in a very different meaning of the word. They may need to get horizontal. They may need to get on their side or go sit down, or they might need to go outside and run around in the yard, or they might need to jump up and down on the spot while they flap their hands and hyperventilate. But all those periods I call rest periods. I should call them sensory reorganization periods, I guess, but I like rest. I like to remind people resting can be running around the building. Controlled environments, obviously, which are standard in our field. Remember that the children are teaching us. They've got their own self-taught strategies, like you've seen in the photographs. They're teaching us, but we can also teach them back to follow the child. Remember that we need to use strategies that are as motivational as possible for the child. And in our early language work, we need to make sure we include appropriate vocabulary for things like body parts, physical feelings, emotional states, and desired activities, not just nouns and verbs, as often happens. And then 2 last slides. Why is all this so important? To understand the challenges, to get, oh, I've already said this, yeah, blah, 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 blah. And my last slide, to be aware of the fundamentally important things which often get overlooked or forgotten. Everything I've talked about this morning is very important. It's not just kiddie stuff, and it's not crazy. To remember that everything the child does almost certainly takes more time, more planning, more energy, more concentration, and more attention than it does for other children. And to realize that things that look crazy might really be functional and clever adaptations, and might actually give us a great insight into the child's cognitive ability and cognitive potential, which otherwise might be artificially low. So 2 hours is up. That was a marathon, and I hope it was helpful, but I hope it will be helpful if you have another look at it. And when you can see all the slides, it might flow more easily. And I'd like to say a big thank you to Jennifer and the closed captioning person. I know I went very quickly, and I kept looking at Jennifer, and you looked totally on top of everything. So thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, David. I know we're running a little over. I haven't seen any questions, but if there are burning questions, very quickly, now's your time. It's a lot of thank yous. We really appreciate your info, David.
Okay, that's good. I mean, what you're describing were the goals I had in my mind. I like the point from the OT. Yeah, I'm an OT wannabe, and that's pretty obvious. But I think occupational therapy is a phenomenal discipline, and I think they're not used well enough. And I think the OTs themselves don't realize how big a role they play in the child's education. It isn't just about getting the right chair. It goes right through. So, you know, utilize your OTs, and you teach them and they teach you, and together the child teaches you all. And before you know it, you're all teaching the child. That's the goal.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you to our captioners. Thank you for all of you who have hung out here for 2 hours online. I know Zoom meetings for 2 hours are rough, but I hope it was good information for all of you.